What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update where I help you guys get on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For all of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role and part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of the Middle Kingdom. I originally put these videos together for my mates back home who are interested in following China along with me. And they told me you should throw this stuff up on YouTube. So if you guys are interested in following China as well and you want to join, we'd love to have you on board. Maybe consider hitting that subscribe button, clicking that bell icon, and you'll get one of these when we release it at the end of every week. It's been a bit of a crazy week. I hope everyone's staying safe wherever you are. It doesn't seem like anywhere is particularly safe at the moment, and we're buckling in for a bit of a rough ride moving into this decade. But with all that said, let's jump into this week's China Update. Now, first up, we need to talk about the economic impact of the coronavirus within China, and particularly the economic impact in January and February when China implemented large-scale quarantine policies across the country, and most severely, of course, in Hubei, which is the province that holds Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak when it originally occurred. Now, those of you who normally watch my videos know that on Monday, I did a deep dive into the data and the statistics that were released by the National Bureau of Statistics on Monday that looked at that very economic data. For those of you who are interested and want to get that deep dive, I would recommend that you look at my last video from Monday to get that data. Here, we're going to talk a little bit more about the most important analysis of the data and what this means for the Chinese economy going forward. But in a nutshell, the data that came out on Monday was terrible. 39 of 41 industries saw a reduction in size. It looks like the economy was growing at -20, and you saw a reduction in both retail spending and a reduction in industrial output, much lower than even the most pessimistic forecasts indicated we would see. Now, this data also looked at the months of January and February, and because a lot of the quarantine policies were not implemented until the 23rd of January, that means we will not have a better idea of the full impact, economic impact of the quarantine policies until at least March. Some analysts believe that the data we saw on Monday could be even worse in March. Now, as of the filming of this week, the central government have said that up to 90% of large-scale industrial production is back online, but not all of these facilities and factories are at full capacity. This number also does not take into account small and medium businesses. Small businesses like restaurants, for example, employ a lot of Chinese, and it's primarily private sector run, so highly efficient and typically employs a lot of people. Unemployment is going to be one of the difficulties for the party going forward. Last month saw the unemployment rate in urban centers rise by 1%. 3 to 4 million people lose their jobs officially. The unofficial number could be higher, and if we look at the effect in the countryside where you have a high concentration of migrant workers who are more susceptible to being laid off in certain industries, then their number could be even higher. The party also this week identified college graduates as a particular area of stress and called on central and local governments to implement policies which would get either graduates jobs or incentives to stay in school, maybe do a higher degree for a year or two. So then you don't have this huge influx of recent graduates that can't find a job. On this point of unemployment, an excellent report which was released by the China Household Finance Survey and Research Center, who do great work, indicated that 40% of households could not go more than 3 months without a fixed income. People who watch this show would know that we reported last year on another major report that was released by another government institution, which found that Chinese debt to disposable income ratios were some of the highest in the world, higher than American levels before the 08-09 financial crisis, and that the bottom 20% of households were disproportionately affected by high debt levels, over 1,000% in the lower 20% of households. So there is particular risk for lower income households of losing income through unemployment and being bankrupt or facing debt issues because of this existing high leverage rate. Avoiding wealth disparities has been a key mission of the Xi Jinping administration, and the government will work hard to try and avoid any exacerbation of the wealth gap, which is already quite severe in China, both officially and unofficially. These reports we've discussed in the past as well, but it will be difficult to get the economy going, avoid mass unemployment, mass bankruptcies, and avoid an exacerbation of this wealth gap. So this will be a particularly difficult juggling trick. Now, Goldman Sachs, the American banking institute, called the data strikingly weak, and on Tuesday said that China's economy was likely to shrink 9% in the first quarter. That reduction in the first quarter would represent the largest drop in growth in a quarter in China since the Cultural Revolution in the 1970s. The bank also lowered its full-year GDP forecast to 3% growth from an earlier estimate of 5.5%. UBS estimates 1.5 to 3% growth this year. They did say, however, if the Chinese government could turn the economy around and if we did see a global recession averted, there could be returns to upwards of 5% growth in China from next year. But those are a lot of ifs. That brings us on to the issue for the Chinese economy of overseas export markets. Though the Chinese economy is not primarily reliant on exports, it still is a major driver of growth, and it does mean that the Chinese state can get those USDs, those US dollars, which they need for a lot of their trade, like their commodity trading, oil markets, etc. Now, exports are down 17% as of Monday, and that could get even worse, seeing as the US and the EU are going to see massive reductions in demand as they now implement their own mass quarantine programs to prevent the spread of the coronavirus in their jurisdictions. Actually, Xi Jinping identified this for the first time this week as a major issue, the idea that export markets are going to be shocked, in a special meeting of the Politburo of the Communist Party in Beijing. You might remember from previous episodes we've discussed the stimulus measures that were used after the global financial crisis back in 2008 and 2009. The primary reason why the government had to turn to massive stimulus was because of the shocks to international export markets. Now, speaking of the stimulus package, how is the government going to respond in terms of its own economic options now? Well, it looks like the central government is going to pump trillions of RMB into the economy. However, the numbers that we're seeing at the moment are still nowhere near the numbers that we saw after the financial crisis, and it looks like this crisis could be worse than that. So there could be more to come. This is in relative terms as a percent of GDP, not in absolute terms. The economy is actually growing quite a lot since 2008 and 2009. Local governments have also been instructed to sell more bonds, and local government bond sales have increased. They will be selling more this year than they were last year. Local government has also been trying to get consumption up. There have been high-profile leadership visits to restaurants that have been shown in local media to try and get Chinese out of their homes and spending again. This actually brings us on to one of the terrible dual policy decisions that a lot of local governments have to make. The central government has said that you have to both, one, control the virus and prevent an outbreak, and two, get the economy back up and running. Now, this is a very difficult policy balance to achieve. If you want to prevent an outbreak, you need social distancing, and a policy in China has been typically to make people stay at home. But if you want to get the economy running again, then you need people out, spending and working. You need to have business confidence. You need to have consumer confidence. Now, there have been 3 cities that have pushed this message of spending, even spending on tourism services, in the very beautiful Nanjing, the relatively beautiful Ningbo, and the not beautiful but has a lovely personality Jinan in Shandong province, which is a major industrial province in East China. At the end of the day, what we have to remember is this economic data that we saw on Monday shows both a supply and a demand side shock, which means there are both deflationary and inflationary risks. The government has to be very careful how it deals with this. You can't use the same tools in the toolbox to deal with this sort of crisis than you would a simple demand side issue. Okay guys, now we need to talk about the health situation. The health situation on the ground in China has improved a lot. It seems that their policies have been relatively successful, and now they're trying to get their economy back up and running. The most critical issue now for the government is to stop imported cases. As of this week, there are now more cases internationally than within the mainland. Imported coronavirus cases in China outnumbered new cases for local transmissions earlier this week, and in fact China on Thursday reported no new local infections. So like I said, the government now has moved to a policy of trying to stop it at the gate. The Ministry of Justice released a report this week saying that those who did not follow the correct rules when they arrived, like the quarantine rules, or not reporting symptoms or having contact with people that have these corona symptoms, face criminal prosecution or even deportation in the case of foreign passport holders. In fact, they have made a big deal of deporting ethnically Chinese people who grew up in China but have foreign passports. They're very serious about trying to stop this thing at the gate and coming back into the country. Key international port cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Canton are testing and quarantining all people moving through these airports. From Thursday, the northern city of Beijing and the capital required that all people flying into the city undergo 14 days of self-paid, concentrated quarantine. Beijing and Shanghai have said they will not cover the costs of any people moving from overseas to these cities if they need medical assistance. And they're actually primarily there talking to overseas Chinese. They don't want overseas Chinese, or actually even Chinese within China itself, moving to these cities to get the superior healthcare that's available in the hospitals. A lot of pressure was put on these cities early on by local residents of these cities that were concerned that people from Wuhan and the wider Hubei area were escaping the province to move to those cities to get that healthcare, thus putting the residents in these cities at risk. Beijing even released a statement this week urging all Chinese students studying overseas to stay in their respective countries and to avoid coming back to China unless it's an emergency. Now, it saddens me that earlier this week I had to write an article where I said I believe that the China-US relationship is in the worst place it has been since normalization in 1979. The relationship is the most toxic, most aggressive, and the most Cold War-like I think I've ever seen in my years of studying it, and that I've ever read since the end of the Mao era. The situation is not good, and it's going to get worse. Those of you who have been watching the show before know that I've discussed many times my concerns about the deterioration in the relationship. Well, let's look at these next two big developments and discuss what it means for the US and China and the world. Those of you who have seen my episodes before know for the last few weeks I've been talking about the narrative, this global public opinion debate that is going on at the moment between China, some other economies in Asia, the US, and the wider industrialized world. That there is a lot of disinformation out there, and exactly how the Chinese state has sought to present a narrative overseas. Now, this last week or so, there's been some development. The Chinese state has been accused of prosecuting a disinformation campaign overseas designed to shift blame internationally and to earn support domestically. There have been opinion pieces written by Chinese embassy staff from Russia to Africa in different languages with a united theme. The ambassador to Kazakhstan, for example, wrote a big piece in their national paper accusing the US of lying, trying to shift blame onto China, and for wasting the time that China gave the world in its effort to fight the global pandemic. Now, there have been two claims in particular that the Chinese side have made that I think is going to greatly exacerbate the relationship. The first was a piece that was in Chinese state media saying that the Chinese side should use its leverage in the production of medical supplies and pharmaceutical products and drugs to push the American side to make concessions for Huawei. Now, whether this is a sensible public policy question or not is up for debate. What I do think is clear is the risk of using this sort of language in the middle of a crisis, particularly for the United States. I think it's going to give ammunition to those in the US who have wanted to push for a greater decoupling with China and calling for more US manufacturing to be pulled out of China back to the US. I think it also gives those in politics, in the government and in the media more ammo, as it were, to push for a more confrontational and Cold War style engagement strategy with China after this outbreak. So that sort of language is quite risky and could have these negative effects on the broader bilateral relationship. Now, the second controversial statement was made via tweet by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Zhao Lijian, in which he accused the United States military of bringing the coronavirus to China. Now, this is a particularly controversial statement. Now, the American condemnation of the accusation was quite swift, and the State Department and the Office of the President both made statements to the Chinese ambassador in Washington and to their counterparts in Beijing, saying that the State Department and the White House would use the terms Chinese virus and the Wuhan virus until the Chinese side recanted this accusation that the virus came from the United States and took more responsibility for its involvement with the initial outbreak in Wuhan. The Chinese side has not backed down. The American side has not backed down. In fact, the Chinese virus policy choice from the White House has become a domestic political issue within the United States itself as well. Some of you guys watching this may have seen it on your social media feeds or in articles. I believe Stephen Colbert even did an episode where he touched on this. Now, at this point, the accusation that the US military brought the coronavirus to China is a unsubstantiated rumor and frankly a conspiracy theory that actually first appeared in Chinese social media as early as January. Actually, this particular rumor, which has had a life of its own in this week, I've seen so many Chinese friends send me different iterations of this particular conspiracy theory, which is going through an evolution in the last few days or so, was actually debunked by Chinese journalists, scientists, and the Beijing municipal government as early as January. I do think this particular exchange is going to be particularly harmful and toxic in the wider China-US relationship, and will probably keep coming up again after this crisis has passed. As of the filming of this, it is the overwhelming consensus of the international scientific community that though we cannot definitively say exactly how it started or where it started, it is highly likely that the outbreak began in Wuhan, and there is no strong evidence to suggest that it was introduced either accidentally or on purpose by any outside country. Now, a more positive example of Chinese public relations and opinion management work has been in its aid programs. The Chinese state is going on a big aid blitz around the world to try and improve its reputation in the midst of this global disaster. And a lot of aid is being promised to places like Iran and Italy. There are huge packages. China is sending medical equipment and experts to developing economies like Pakistan, as well as countries like Italy and Spain. Jack Ma, the founder of Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba, has donated 500,000 coronavirus test kits and 100 million masks to help America cope with the epidemic. Okay, finally, and another piece that is relevant to the China-US relationship, but also globally very, very relevant, is Beijing's expulsion of American journalists this week. So Beijing announced that it would expel American journalists working for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. It has also demanded that these outlets, as well as the Voice of America and Time Magazine, provide the government with information about their operations. Now, those of you who have been watching this show would not be surprised, because I told you this would likely happen, and we've followed this as another step in a tit-for-tat between the United States and Beijing over journalists operating in their respective jurisdictions. This began when Beijing expelled journalists working for the Wall Street Journal for an article that Beijing found overly offensive. The US responded by reducing the number of employees Chinese state-run media outlets that had recently been designated as foreign missions in the US. So there was a reduction of several dozen employees. Some of these were journalists that could not operate within these institutions, within these state media outlets in the United States. And so this decision from Beijing is a further escalation of that tit-for-tat issue with journalists that we're seeing between the two countries. Now, I think it's important that I read you verbatim what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said regarding this expulsion. First, in response to the US designation of 5 Chinese media agencies as foreign missions, China demands, in the spirit of reciprocity, that the China-based branches of Voice of America, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Time declare in written form information about their staff, finance, operation, and real estate in China. Second, in response to the US slashing the staff size of Chinese media outlets in the US, which is expulsion in all but name, China demands that journalists of US citizenship working for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, whose press credentials are due to expire before the end of 2020, notify the Department of Information and Ministry of Foreign Affairs within 4 calendar days, starting from today, and hand back their press cards within 10 calendar days. They will not be allowed to continue working as journalists in the People's Republic of China, including its Hong Kong and Macau special administrative regions. Now, this order is controversial enough, but that final line is particularly interesting because it says that these journalists cannot go to Hong Kong now. Now, the reason this is controversial as well is because it could represent a breach of the rights that Hong Kong enjoys under the basic law, its mini constitution, which allows it a degree of semi-autonomy under the 一国两制, or one country, two systems framework, which have been in place since the 97 handover. Now, this will have its own ramifications within the context of the continued unrest in Hong Kong, but it could also have a secondary effect again on the US-China relationship. Because again, people who watch my show know that last year the United States and President Trump signed into law the so-called Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. And within that act, it enabled the government to put sanctions on individuals within China who are seen to undermine the autonomy of Hong Kong. And this expulsion could be argued to undermine that autonomy, which is required now by law in the US to be included in any Secretary of State report. So again, this could further complicate the nature of the relationship. Okay guys, I know that was a lot, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or any comments, criticisms, or disagreements with my analysis, please throw your thoughts below. I'm more than happy to engage in any sort of conversation you want to have regarding China or whatever. Please stay safe, and I will see you guys next week on China Update.